there was a list of demands. But these guys are demonstrating, but what do they want? I mean, what do they want the government to do? That's not clear.
Which is in a way, I think, is a reflection of the fact that it is not against anything or on a subject. It is just frustration. It is just a pent up anger, maybe.
No, some of it is very well organized.
Yeah. There's always the fringe elements which exploit the situations.
Yeah, I mean, here, and some of them calling this, Antifa movement. So I didn't even know what this Antifa movement was.
And what is that? I haven't heard that.
I know. So it's apparently stands for anti-fascist.
Oh, okay.
Anti-fascist movement. I mean, come on, have some sense of proportion.
That's very painful. Have you started classes now?
No, classes are over now.
Yeah, so
okay. Why did I lose you? I have your voice. Somebody is doing something. Okay, the screen is being played with. What is happening? Is my video off? I don't get it.
They're setting it there. Yeah, you're okay now. You can see each other.
Okay.
Amazingly, the response for a virtual session, I think, is at an all-time high. We never had this kind of attendance in the past sessions of CII, annual sessions of CII.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's what I'm told. Yeah, I haven't seen
that. That is incredible. I thought, it will be you, me, and Jeff.
No. Yesterday I was in a webinar. It's a small association, and I just said yes to it because I knew the people very well. And incredibly, some 300 odd people. I expected 30 people. It was 300.
My goodness! Wow.
I think people have more time now, and I think webinar is a good way of.
If people are interested, then it is also a hell of a lot easier, to just log in and get onto it. Whereas, for physical presence, you really have to make a huge effort.
Partly because we know each other in an establishment or an office or an organization. There is social capital.
I think moderating sessions is an art. Moderating it well. I mean, if
not very taxing if we have distinguished people like you. It becomes
you see,
complex when you have to fill up the blanks.
No, but
Both of you, I don't need to do that.
No, you'll need to ask questions. You see, it's 10 minutes will fill up each, but there's a 20 minutes of burden on you, and then of course the audience will do the remaining 10 minutes.
I haven't got any questions because this is such a open-ended kind of subject that I thought I'll pick these questions after both of you say. I really don't have a list of questions, but we can develop this as we go along.
Yeah. And Jeff alone can hold the fort, so I think there should be no problem.
You're keeping a track of what's happening on the Indian economic situation. I'm sure you are.
Very much. Yeah.
Are you feeling good or feeling concerned? You're feeling.
I'm sort of in a way I'm unaffected to some degree because you got to deal with the health situation, and as you deal with the health situation, the other things will fall in place. But as if the workers cannot get to work, you cannot generate supply response. So I don't believe all this that almost everyone is talking about this stimulus from fiscal side. Meaning you can increase demand, but if people are not there to work on it, you're not going to get a supply response.
No,
So first thing,
this is a serious situation now because I think the soft underbelly of the Indian uh, manufacturing service sector that's got exposed. It is truly a concern that right at the foundational level, at the bottom of the pyramid, at the foundations, you've got uh, such a wobbly kind of a structure, and very,
we
very.
chose it. We chose it for 70 years. We chose it. See, we relegated everything to these micro and tiny little. I mean, you go to farming, you got 70 million farms, which are less than quarter hectare. Average size, average size is quarter hectare, and they're all less than half hectares. 70 million. That's about half of the farms. Half of the
Yeah,
farms. What can you do there? Likewise, you go to your enterprises. Everything, your in industry and services, 75% of the workforce in less than 20, in enterprises less than 20 workers, about 60% about 60% of it in less than 5 workers.
yeah,
We chose it.
yeah.
And
And
we still look,
and I also we glorified it. We just not
very
chosen.
glorified,
We
absolutely.
glorified it.
And this whole MSME, and they work only on the first M, the micro. They don't work on the second M, which is medium.
Yeah. You made that point earlier. Yeah, that we're overlooking the importance of size and drawing
Absolutely.
comfort and saying that we have this tiny economy which is
No, no, we
glorified
refuse.
the barely subsistence level survival economy as
Yeah,
something which is our right. It isn't. It's that
yeah,
weakness has been exposed now
yeah.
inexorably.
And and these are guys who have been basically walking in the same spot for the last several generations.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, it's a treadmill on which they are just running and running, but going nowhere.
No, the fact that you've got close to 150 million people at subsistence level, adding economic value upwards is not a sustainable model.
Yeah, well, we are sustaining it for 70 years.
Yeah, sometimes I wonder is it because we've been far too sentimentalist as a country, far too maybe religion has been one of the reasons, fatalistic.
I think that reason is a circular one, which is that you got 44% of the workers in the farms, 42% of the workers, so that's 86, 42% of the workers in enterprises less than 20. That's 86% of the workforce. Those are your votes. So
Yeah,
everything is got to do for my farmers, got to do for
exactly.
my little fellows. So everything you do is you want to, and how do you keep them happy? You let the remaining 14% produce the output and then tax them, redistribute. So we try to, we just want to redistribute, but then you realize that redistribution, there is not enough revenues.
So
So
poverty has been an important instrument of democracy for us. It's a very active instrument of
absolutely, absolutely.
yeah. There's been a vested interest developed over several decades.
There is a black economist in the US who is very right wing, Tom Sowell. So many years ago, almost 2 3 decades ago, he wrote something where he had a great line. He said, the poor are a the poor are a gold mine, and everybody
Already will go.
everybody exploits them.
Yeah. Much the same way that illiteracy has been institutionalized because it is helpful to the kind of democracy that we practiced.
Yeah, and the problem is, the politicians may not be doing it deliberately, but they are doing it without understanding.
Yeah, so that I agree. I think there is lack of understanding of the kind of fundamental flaws and the wobbly foundation that we have built on our system, both in the social sense and in the economic sense, and leadership being unaware of this weakness.
And there's some sort of, unwillingness to try to understand it. I mean, it's not that people have not tried to explain. But there's a sort of, some mulishness in refusing. And of course, this whole socialist baggage we carried that continues with us. I mean, that's the part of the uh, toolkit we carry. That the intellectual toolkit. That everything we try to see it through the socialist prism.
Yeah, but that we are supposed to have kicked 30 years ago, and we still
No, no. I mean,
get rid of that. It's not a good commentary on the subsequent kind of ideologies either.
yeah, no, no. The ruling class is not kicked up, and particularly your bureaucracy, which remains incredibly entrenched and powerful. There are some good people in the bureaucracy who are which are the reasons why some reforms did happen.
Oh yeah,
But the central tendency of the bureaucracy is very socialist.
yeah, control.
I
So
mean,
it's,
look what we have done now during the COVID. The whole economic policy making has moved into home ministry, and that's the kiss of death to the economy. I mean, home ministries, they like to control.
yeah.
And right now, they basically, whatever the finance ministry does is gets undone by the home ministry.
Mm.
And that goes also at the state level. So you got this massive some 5,000 plus circulars have come out of India in the last 2 months.
This is something which obviously could not have been planned, but it also exposes the kind of shallowness
The
in terms of
system that tells you the system.
absolutely.
Right? At the minimum, what you do is, if when you issue a new circular, you automatically should kill the previous one. But you keep the previous one and you add the new one.
So the joke goes that until we've had at least 10 clarifications of the circular issued, the certificate the notification is not complete, not certain. Bidisha, what's happening? It's 6:05. Bidisha, are you there?
We lost Bidisha too.
Yes.
Yeah, you're there. Yeah. So are we waiting for Jeff or what?
Yeah, that's what I was trying to check. I don't have a number for him. I had mailed him, but not yet got a reply. So,
Oh God. Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
Dr. Panagaria, would you have any idea?
I don't have his phone number. No, I communicate. I mean, I rarely communicate with him, but when I do it on the email.
So, I had sent a joint mail to both of you, but
No, wait, have you sent an email today?
yes, I did.
Then yeah. So no, I mean, I got your email.
You did?
Yeah, I got yours. Yeah.
Right. Let me just try and check what's if we can get in touch.
Also send him the link. It's very probable that he didn't see Chandrajit's email, which is where the link was.
Okay, I'll do that.
There are not many participants anyway. Well, the parallel sessions taking place, so I don't know. I don't see participants.
There are none.
No, I was
If
told
there are
that
none,
in the
then
morning there was phenomenal participation, so I don't see any.
okay, if there are no participants, then
As
we
to
can
say, it
just
might be
chat.
just be the three of us, yeah.
Yeah, then we might just as well chat among ourselves and go. We may have a very different conversation in that case.
Probably be more exciting to have a private conversation.
Yeah, right. I'd never heard your name before. So I checked out. It means Vishnu.
Yes, that's right. Yes. one who reclines on the serpent.
Yes. Oh, I see. That's the particular form of Sheshai.
Yes, there is, yeah, the one who's a
Oh, I see. So Shesh is
Shai,
coming from Shesh Nag. Is Shesh coming from Shesh Nag?
Krishnag. Shai is one who,
Ah, and one who, of course, Dharashai. Ah,
that gives me the
Sheshai.
excuse for being lazy.
Sorry?
That
Oh,
gives me
you
the
are an
excuse of
excuse.
being lazy.
Yeah, right. You don't do it. I hope you don't do a Sheshai to us, the panelists. Uh,
So I have sent him the link. Let's see if he joins. Would you like to start the session, Dr.
But
Sesh?
I don't see participants. So is this not showing on the screen or what?
No. They won't be shown on the screen.
Oh, okay, right. So
somewhere it must tell you how many are there, doesn't it?
Yeah.
okay, so
It
maybe
says
we should
attendance,
start.
attendee one total.
Okay, if it doesn't show on the screen, that's fine. Yeah.
No, it shows only one. It shows one.
That was one.
Maybe you, I don't know, Vidisha, if that's you.
No, I have joined as a panelist. So there is one person in the audience.
Okay.
No, Vidisha, if Jeff is not joining and we don't have anyone, should we continue or should we call off?
So I was just talking to IT. They are saying that the attendee list doesn't show here. So please go ahead and start the session.
Okay, all right. All right, so are you going to now switch on for others as well? Good evening and good morning. And we have an interesting session today. Let me welcome our two distinguished panelists. One of them is yet to join, Dr. Jeffrey Sachs. We have Dr. Arvind Panagaria. Both of them don't require any introduction, so I can therefore move on to the subject of the today's discussion straight away. This is a somewhat audacious topic in the context of the current situation, and the question that has been put in front of us is that is it possible to have a more integrated and sustainable global economic order post-COVID? So that's a somewhat audacious statement, and I'll tell you why I feel that way. Firstly, pre-COVID, we had a situation when probably global integration was at its height. Perhaps as never before in the history of mankind, we had a very high level of globalization, whether it was in terms of supply chain or in terms of cross-border investments or in terms of currency. We had a very, very deeply integrated globalized economy. If you had an automobile coming out of factory in Detroit, you were certain to see at least 10 countries contributing by way of raw materials or components to making the automobile. And if you're looking at issues such as currency movements, you can look at the kind of capital flows that have happened in the last decade or so amongst the countries. If you look at service industry, one continent you have somebody writing a software, you have some other continent testing that software, third one embedding that software in a chip, and the fourth one, and the entire world consuming that. So you really have an inexorably connected world. But on the other hand, globalization as a political ideology or a social ideology or even an economic ideology had almost lost its charm. Primarily because it was seen to not have delivered on its promise. Uh, there was this the complaint that this globalization had deepened inequalities in many countries, in many societies. It had divided the world. You had some countries which had benefited hugely, such as China and some of the Southeast Asian economy. We have Dr. Jeffrey Sachs joining us. Welcome, Dr. Sachs. We just begun the session. We have Arvind Panagaria with us already. I was just saying that you have obviously seen the topic for the discussion, and this is a particularly strange, provocative topic, considering the fact that despite a deep globalized economy that we had pre-COVID, globalization was losing its charm as an economic ideology because it was seen to have not delivered on its promise, particularly with inequalities rising in many countries, and some countries disproportionately gaining than others. So that was the kind of situation pre-COVID. And then the COVID happened. And in the COVID, we have seen while there was a common global enemy, this was not a fight amongst countries in the world, this was a common global enemy, if I might call that. When globally nations should have got together to fight, globally nations should have got together to develop the solutions for this kind of a problem, we saw exactly the opposite happening. We saw nations shutting out the other nations, closing their borders, competing with each other to preemptively procure from scarce supply sources, uh, blaming each other for the pandemic, in fact, reviving some old wars amongst the nations. So we saw exactly the opposite reaction when the countries should have got together to commonly to fight a common global enemy, and we didn't see that. Now, post-COVID, the question that has been put in front of us is, are we going to have now a more integrated, a more sustainable global economy post-COVID? In other words, are we going to simply say that COVID was a distraction and let's now move on? In any case, we have gone too far ahead on globalization. It's far too deep. It's not going to be possible for us to rewind. And in any event, that's the only way to move forward in terms of lifting the global economy to a sustainable level. There's no other way to do that, and therefore let's move on and deepen this global engagement. Is that the response that we're going to see, or are we going to say that given the fact that the nations have reacted to be far more nationalistic now, more inward, suspicious of each other, are we going to see perhaps a very different kind of a world where perhaps self-reliance would become the sort of a mantra for each country, uh, and perhaps cooperating globally for common issues such as the climate change or a pandemic, or building new global institutions of a different kind of a global order, somewhat like the Bretton Woods institutions, to cooperate to lift the economies which have been ravaged by pandemic so that they can be on a growth path, but limited to that. So what's going to be the kind of growth model for the global economy post-COVID? Or is there some other kind of a solution for lifting the global economy from the kind of depths that it has been pushed into as a result of global pandemic? That's a question in front of us. So once again, my welcome to all the distinguished panelists. The format for this would be that Dr. Sachs and Dr. Panagaria would make an opening remark for about maybe 8 to 10 minutes, following which we'll have a discussion for about 15, 20 minutes, and then we could have a Q&A for another 10, 15 minutes. Let me pass this over to Dr. Jeffrey Sachs, very distinguished, globally renowned economist, known for his seminal work on fight against poverty. He's a special advisor to the Secretary General of United Nations. Someone who does not need the introduction. So let me pass this over to Dr. Sachs.
Thank you very much. Thanks for taking on such an important discussion. The reasons for globalization are very deep, in that the world economy and world society does better with openness, with trade, with the flow of financial capital, with flow of ideas, with the movement of people. This epidemic doesn't change that fundamental point. And if it leads to a closure of the world, the costs would be far greater than the direct costs of the epidemic itself. I don't think we should see this epidemic in that light. The fact that countries took steps urgently to stop the movement of people when a virus was spreading is different from stopping globalization. So I have no problem with the countries putting visitors in quarantine in the short term when they're coming from places with high incidence of the disease. I have no problem with temporary closures of borders, but this should not be understood as a fundamental break with the lessons of history, that we do better when we are open and interconnected rather than closed, inward looking, and cut off from the rest of the world. The real dynamic in the world is a little bit different right now, and that is that the United States is trying to break the global system by trying to mobilize India and Europe to contain China. So what is really happening is a geopolitical challenge. The US views China as a threat to US primacy, and so it is taking every measure to stop the flow of technology to China, to blame China for this epidemic, to absent the US from international agreements, and even from the World Health Organization. It is wooing India to say, join us, we stand up to China. If the world goes this way, this will be potentially disastrous for everybody. Very short-sighted. That kind of nationalism will likely lead to war, not to peace or prosperity. Why is the US doing this? The US is doing this because the basic doctrine of the US is chauvinism, of US primacy, and China is a threat to primacy. That's not surprising, by the way, because China is 4 times larger than the US, and so any kind of normal development in China will be viewed as a threat to US supremacy or hegemony or primacy. And if it's China today, it will be India in the future. Right now, the US woos India. In the future, the US will view India as a threat because India also is more than 4 times larger than the United States, or will be more than 4 times larger. And as India develops, believe me, knowing the American mentality, India will be viewed as a threat, not as a friend, because the US view is a really unusual, which follows from the British Empire, that US is the heir to global primacy, that the world is only safe with American values, and this is what's really going on in the world. I think India, I think, made a big mistake personally in not joining the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, because that is an important group of China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and ASEAN. And if India were part of it, that would be quite impressive, of more than 3 billion people that are working together for open trade, no matter what silliness the United States tries to impose. The fact of the matter is that the Asia Pacific region of the 15 countries, ASEAN, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, have the epidemic mostly under control right now, with the worrying partial exception of Indonesia. But I think the RCEP region could be the one to open up amongst itself first and help to rejuvenate the world economy. The most pressing issue for India by far is to stop the epidemic. That has to be done through public health means. It can't be done through lockdowns. It has to be done through very, very detailed, extensive testing, tracing, and quarantining people to stop this horrible outbreak before it does real damage to India. And India is very vulnerable, and it's right on the knife edge right now of containment versus mass outbreak. So the public health challenge is by far the preeminent challenge for India right now. Use your sophisticated information technology systems, use GEO, use Bharti, use every means you can to get information flowing. Use the ASHA workers, use the community health workers, deploy information systems, but crack down on the spread of the virus, not through a generalized lockdown, but by absolutely rapidly identifying infectious people, clusters of infection, and helping them to safely isolate in public quarantine facilities, or in the cases where it's safe to do, in their residences at home. Beware congregate settings of shelters of workers, for example, where this virus rips through these shelters, or retirement communities, or prisons, or other religious gatherings, which are super spreader events. But I would say the two main things that I would like to conclude with: stop the epidemic. I'll say three things: stop the epidemic, continue to be an open economy, and don't join the foolishness of the United States in trying to oppose China. Cooperate with China, cooperate with ASEAN, cooperate with the Asia Pacific region. In fact, cooperate with everybody, but don't listen to the silliness of my country. And by the way, we're in an absolute breakdown of governance in the United States. Trump is the worst president in American history. I'm sorry to tell you, but it's absolutely true. If I have any time to elaborate, I would be happy to do so. But he is absolutely trying to promote martial law right now in the United States, shooting on people, tear gassing people, calling the troops out. He wants this. This is not in resistance. This is his attempt to grab more power. So please be careful, India. This is not your game. This is an American game. You have other interests, and your interests are openness and good relations with your neighbors. Thanks very much.
Thanks. I think Professor Jeffrey Sachs, you have lived up to your reputation again of being absolutely candid, absolutely direct with your remarks, and these are very insightful remarks, and there is bound to be a lot of discussion on what you have said. Let me turn this over to Dr. Arvind Panagaria. He needs no introduction to this audience. Dr. Panagaria, as you know, was the first vice chairman of Niti Aayog. He is a professor of economics at Columbia, very distinguished economist. Thanks for joining us, Arvind. So would you like to give your perspective on what the global growth economic growth is likely to, what path it's likely to take, and in particular, in the context of what Jeffrey Sachs said, that we're going to be seeing this flexing of muscles between China and the US, somewhat reminiscent of the Cold War situation. And in that context, in that kind of historical kind of replay, where would you say is the global integration going to take place from an economic standpoint?
Thank you, Shesh. You put me at a big disadvantage by putting me after Jeff. It's hard to say anything new or additional after he has spoken. But let me try. One, I start off actually by echoing him that this is not a big shock from which globalization is not going to recover. In fact, historically, whether you go back all the way to the 14th century, the Black Death epidemic or pandemic, that was also a pandemic of the 14th century. You can go back to the Spanish flu of 20th century. You can go back to the Great Depression, go to 9/11, go to global financial crisis. Every time these things happen, we think that this is globalization is now in danger and so forth. And every time we have actually come back out and globalized more, not less. And particularly, I remember of 9/11, New York City, where we are. One had thought that New York City will be a very different kind of city after 9/11. And immediately after that, everybody was predicting that life will be totally different. It didn't happen. I think, we beefed up our protections. The security at the airports got a little tougher. But other than that, we came back. And trade, in fact, flourished incredibly. And that was the period actually during which China really rose up, both in terms of its trade and therefore globalization through trade, and also in terms of its own size of the economy. I think, the first decade of the 2000s is the defining decade for China. I think this is the same thing that will happen again. We'll beef up our protections against future epidemics and pandemics, but I think we'll continue to come back to trading and as well as capital flows moving in the way it had been happening. So that's my point number one. Point number two, I think this pandemic may very well actually lead to greater globalization on one dimension, which is the integration of labor markets. There has been a discovery during this period, even including myself, I'm sure Jeff also, that last 2 months of lecturing we did in the spring semester was online. If you had asked me prior to this 2 months whether online lecturing could be done, I would have said, no, you can't really run a university online. But we almost did. And now look back also at the Facebook, for example, which says that even post-COVID, we are going to have probably only 25% of our workers actually in the workplace. The 75% will work remotely. If that happens, you can see that labor markets, will extend. Boundaries of the labor markets will extend well beyond the H-1B visas. You'll not require probably H-1B visas for most workers. They will be working remotely from their own countries. And so that could actually lead to massive expansion of globalization. So that's my second point. And here, of course, India can come out to be a big winner, but that will require India to fix up its higher education system, as well as, of course, school education system as well. That's something very, very important. 70 years have passed, and since 1991, about almost 30 years now since reforms, we have not undertaken serious higher education reforms, nor school education reforms. So that's waiting to happen. And if you want to take advantage of what I think might happen post-COVID into the global labor markets, that's something very important to look at. My third point, again, Jeff has said that, and this is to do with the global institutions, multilateralism, that has been under threat already. I mean, that was pre-COVID, that the United States simply was not, did not even let the dispute settlement appellate tribunals to be appointed. And as a result, now we are down to 2 appellate judges, which means that there is not a quorum. You need at least 3 to do the judgments. So now, that dispute settlement, which is a very, very central plank of the WTO system, is off. It's not working. Also, before that, the negotiating process had been very much blocked. And that goes back to the problems that arose because of the rise of the developing countries, Brazil, India, China, those 3 in particular. So that really, destroyed the old Quad, which was Canada, United States, European Union, and Japan. And it replaced it by a new Quad, which simply is much less workable. So, after the WTO came into existence, we tried to launch the Doha round. In the end, it didn't succeed. And really, other than the trade facilitation agreement, we have had no other successes. So that, I think, is now further complicated by the US-China tensions. Jeff already spoke about that. I need not elaborate on it, but that's going to remain a bit of a problem. And so the issue really may turn into, can the rest of the world go on? I think they can. And finally, let me just come to, the last point. Last point is that going forward, as far as globalization is concerned, India is going to be absolutely central and very important key to the whole process. I think if India does the right things in the next 20 years, it can do what China did in the past 20 years. And doing the right thing, of course, includes, very importantly, being very open economy. Unfortunately, on that dimension, we have reversed a bit. In the last 3 years, there have been many tariffs that have been raised back. You hear a lot more about this import substitution. I thought, after 1991, we had finally given up that particular part of our socialist philosophy, but it seems to have returned. I see hardly any kind of voices speaking out against import substitution in India. Unfortunately, even CII sort of shies away, but as an institution, at least, it has to carry the flag for openness, not for import substitution. So I think that is one very important factor India has to, and that is where also what Jeff already said, RCEP, I think is very important for India to get into it. I understand why India stayed out, that the deal that was offered was not good enough. That was also the official view that was expressed by Jaishankar, by others in the government. But I think we need to stay engaged and bring this to a conclusion. Absolutely, it's a very large market for India, but more than that, actually, you see, today we are wanting a lot of the multinationals to come to our shores because wages have risen in China. Even excluding the US-China trade tensions, multinationals had been moving outside of China because of the rising wages, at least in the sectors that ought to be very important for India, which are all the labor-intensive sectors, the apparel, the footwear, furniture, all kinds of assembly activities, processing, etc. These are all extremely important for India as it modernizes, as it transforms, because, today 44% of its workforce isn't farming. Now, with about less than 15% of GDP in farming and overall very low level of per capita income in the first place, you can't sustain, you can't combat poverty, you cannot transform, you cannot bring prosperity to a large part of the population without a lot of these workers moving out into industry and services. And they are not going to go into IT or pharmaceuticals or petroleum refining or the engineering goods industries, machinery, etc. They require jobs in which they can be trained in a short period of time. And certainly, I've talked to people in industry, in apparel, footwear, etc., and they can train workers, to do the most modern kind of manufacturing of apparel in just 6 weeks. So that's the kind of area, and this is a total, $700 to $800 billion global market. China today exports about 150 to 160 billion. We are doing less than 20 billion. I think that's a market for us to take over. Footwear, same way, $50–60 billion China exports. That's a market for us to take over. Furniture, again, it's a market for us to take over. And we can really transform ourselves while also, and for that is where the RCEP really becomes very important key, because you want the multinationals that are going to come in and locate there, and our own companies as well, to have access to both free access to their inputs as well as free access to exporting to these markets. So it's a very crucial thing. And I wish actually down the road we will also sign an agreement with the European Union and eventually with the United States as well. I mean, US, there is a bit more problem because agriculture is a big issue. The US is very competitive in agriculture. India is very defensive in agriculture. So that's going to be a bit of a challenge. With Europe, that problem is not there. Political issues may also be less. So I think, India, if it goes out, stays open, opens up furthermore, knocks down all the tariffs that it had introduced in the last 3 years, go down yet further. Actually, I have pitched that we have to get down to about 7% tariff on all products. That's the most we should do. I mean, I'd be quite happy if we go free trade, but if we can't go free trade, let's bring them down to about 7%. And then forge agreements with the RCEP, European Union, maybe down the road, US. So that's what we ought to do. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have common ground amongst all of us that globalization is something that is not going to get reversed. We've gone far too deep into this, and that's clearly the only way to move forward. And therefore, probably it'll get reset in terms of the terms of trade and the engagement with different countries. But globalization will proceed. I think that's common ground. Jeff, you made some very important point, and something which would probably be seen to be very provocative in the current context in India, and that is to do with the equation that India has with China. Just now, because of the kind of issues that we have seen in the border in the last few weeks, there is this huge anti-China feeling, almost to the extent of saying that I think there is some group which is now beginning to say that we should boycott Chinese goods. The rivalry between India and China has been a motivation for India to some extent. But in the process of that, China has always seen to be the rival, the competitor, not someone that we can deal with. Although that we had good passes, we had good personal equation between Prime Minister Modi and with the leaders in China, but currently the situation is very different on the ground. And you said that rather than fighting with China, cooperate with China. Cooperation with China, what kind of shape do you think it should take from India perspective?
Well, look, India is a big and powerful country, and like China, is not only a country, it's a civilization. And so India and China should have a stable, long-term, detailed interrelation, not just sporadic meetings, and not just meetings of the leaders, and not just headline events, but actually a systematic foreign policy between the two countries with detailed working groups on many different issues. Of course, the border is one, security issues, economic issues, social, cultural issues, geopolitical issues. So I would like to see institutionalized between India and China a deeper interrelationship, business to business, of course, government to government with several task forces and working groups, and also to see this in the context of RCEP, which Arvind and I, both emphasize as being something very important for India. So when it comes to China, I don't think that it is right, accurate, possible, or befitting to approach China through trading headlines, accusations, barbs. I think the only way to approach China is through very detailed, methodical, bureaucratic discussion, bureaucracy to bureaucracy, government to government, CII to leading business groups in China. Of course, there should be competition. How could there not be competition? Two great countries, 1.4 billion people each, with different visions and so on. I'm not against competition, and I'm not against the diversity, but I do believe it should be a stable relationship, an open relationship. I, by and large, agree with China not to meddle in the internal affairs of other countries. I think the world is safer when we do that. I do think that all countries should abide by common standards. The common standards that I like are the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and treaty obligations such as created the World Trade Organization. So to my mind, we don't meddle internally. We don't pick cold wars. And when it comes to great countries, we don't do it through superficial means of, a visit by leaders or headline accusations, but we do it in a very systematic way. After all, it's grim to say, but also crucial to say that both India and China are nuclear superpowers, so it would be a mistake to have anything other than a very stable relationship and a very deeply institutionalized relationship. I think it should be based on international trade principles and from a financial point of view and on uh, specifically regional comprehensive trade agreement, because that would open up many, many avenues for more detailed discussion of key sectors, technologies, standards, climate change policies, and so on, which I think the two countries really need to do. My main mindset is that we're at the end of American leadership. America's not going away, but it's no longer the world leader by any sense. Just look at our president. You know, this is not leadership. This is, I won't use the word that comes to mind because it's not a polite word, but this is not at all leadership. So India has to become one of the world leading countries in helping to manage the global system. It has to see itself as one of the few principal power centers of the world, aiming for global stability, to avoid conflict, to keep an open system, to promote the new technologies, which fortunately India has a great strength in when it comes to the information technologies and can go further and faster as well. And so in this sense, think of the post-US leadership world. How do you view China in such a world? Well, you don't want open conflict. You don't want a breakdown. What you want is a multipolar world in which India is one of the poles and China is another. The European Union is another. The United States, no doubt, is another, but not what the US wants to entice India into an anti-China alliance. This is absurd for two neighbors to get into that, especially with the US being such a flaky country from many points of view right now. So India needs to deepen its relations in foreign policy terms with China, and I think through RCEP with all of the Asia Pacific region. This is where huge markets are as well, and where the big technological gains are going to take place. And that is well beyond any simple event. And it starts from the premise, here are two civilizations that are here to stay, and they're the two largest countries, most populous countries in the world. They have enormous joint interests together, starting with peace and then following up with economics, trade, technology, climate, environment, and many, many other things. And this should be on a very deep and serious relationship. And there is no other framework for it. That's my real point. This is not the Cold War where it was the choose your side or be non-aligned, whatever. This is not a new Cold War. This is a multipolar world in which India has a major role and major responsibilities, and that requires a deep engagement with China.
Well, the journey with China so far has been one step forward, one step backward. So you're really saying that you got to make 3 steps forward. If there's a 1 step backward, never mind that. You got to keep moving in the direction. That's a very different approach to what we currently see as the way forward. But I completely agree with you personally. That's the right way for India.
So
we have to really contextualize this in the geopolitical situation as it exists today. Arvind, turning to you, you made this point that we ought to be really opening up even more, not to go back to the days when we had this high tariffs. We are bringing it down. We have now seen in recent terms a reversal of that trend. We've been increasing this tariff. And then there is this jingoism about, make in India, self-reliance. There is this walking away from the RCEP. Now, how do you see some of these signals? Are we going too far into the south when we have to be traveling north? Is this something which is reversible, you think?
So before I answer that, I do want to say a few things about the discussion that has happened on China. I mean, I have some disagreement here with Jeff because I think China is a very different kind of power. It is an aggressive power. It is a belligerent power, and it flexes its muscle around its neighborhood. So it was to some degree, it's very hard for India to have with China the kind of relationship that Jeff is advocating. I'd like it to be like that, but realistically, can it happen? I have a little bit of doubts. In particular, I think, the border, because there is a very long common border between India and China. And
a long history of disputes.
And there's a long history and all. And luckily, we have managed this extremely well after the 1962 war. Yeah. And I hope we can continue to manage it that way. Right. But Jeff had also said something earlier that, that if India had been, when India gets large like China, then the US would have a problem with India as well. I think that's a correct statement. But that got me to thinking that suppose, Narasimha Rao had come to India in 1980 and Deng Xiaoping had come to China in early 1990s. And therefore, India would have been where China is today and China would have been where India is today. I think we would have seen a very different world. India is not belligerent. It would have cooperated, largely speaking. And the kinds of tensions we have today would much fewer, I would say. I accept the fact that the United States would kind of not like the fact that India has become larger and almost an equal power, but I think the equation would have been a little bit better, different. So this is where I come now. Nevertheless, I agree that what we ought to do is continue to manage the border with China and these relations with China in the way we are doing it. And continue to open on trade. I think we got big time to benefit from trade with China. And this whole thing about, somehow this large trade deficit and therefore there's something wrong with it is a bilateral. I mean, even the multilateral deficit is largely an issue of investment and savings. I'll not go into that, but the bilateral one makes simply no sense, meaning, I have a huge surplus with Columbia University and a very large deficit with everybody else. Because Columbia is where I earn my income and everywhere else is where I spend my income. That's the right thing for me to do. I mean, if I try to reduce my deficit with the others, I will be, making my own furniture, doing my own things and not buying things outside. That will be crazy. So bilateral deficit just is a complete red herring. So I wouldn't worry about that aspect at all. Actually, we ought to, on trade side, we ought to proceed. We ought to, and this is where I come back now to answer your question, that we are actually reversing something from which we benefited. I mean, if you go back, look, the trade data, what happened between 2003 and 2011, 9 years of incredibly fast growth, 8% plus growth in real terms. And trade, expanded by a factor of 5 from about 50 billion or 60 billion, I think it went to some 300 billion. This is the merchandise trade of India over that period from 2003 to 2012. So obviously trade was a key factor in that very rapid growth that we experienced. So reversing something that we have ourselves benefited greatly from is not going to serve us well. I'm not so much, by the way, perturbed by the talk of self-reliance. I think that's a very different context. Prime Minister was speaking to the rural India at the time, and he was speaking in the context of COVID, and in the context that there was a lot of demands being made that give us these huge US style kind of transfers, which India really could not afford. I mean, US is a very different country. It can print dollars. Printing rupees is not the same thing. So that is the sense, I think, in which Prime Minister said, look, I mean, we ought to become self-reliant, meaning that we ought to earn our own incomes. That is how I see that particular strand of thought that has been coming, and many are thinking, reinterpreting self-reliance in terms of self-sufficiency. I don't think that's what was said. I mean, I'll be astonished. I mean, if really Prime Minister by self-reliance means self-sufficiency, I would think that we would very quickly see a huge movement back towards autarky. I hope that doesn't happen. That will be a huge mistake. So we need to get back. Yes, liberalization along all fronts. That I think has done good to us, and we ought to keep moving in that direction.
We may not have much time for Q&A, so let me just make just one, or raise just one question with each of you, and maybe that we will wind up the session with that. Jeff, you are known to be the shock therapist. You got the Soviet Union to adopt a free market situation with your advice. Now, what was the advice, one shock therapy that you think you will prescribe for India to get back to its economic growth post-pandemic?
Thanks a lot. Shock therapy means addressing an underlying problem decisively. And in the case of the current crisis, there is no doubt that the shock therapy is to contain the epidemic itself. Please don't let it get out of control, because if there is continuing spread of the virus at a significant rate, the economy will not function. In fact, society will not function properly. India has not lost control of the epidemic yet, and it still has the potential to contain it, but it's very fragile. When I look at the daily data, the estimate of what's called the basic reproduction number, that is the rate of growth of new infections, is greater than 1 in India, consistently in the international estimates. This suggests that the virus is not being suppressed yet adequately. It is less than 1 in almost all of the Asia-Pacific region. So this is what I would prescribe. Public health as good economics, stop the epidemic. Then, and by the way, if Indonesia can be helped to do the same, then this whole RCEP region, which we've been talking about, will be the first region of the world to open up together. That would be quite amazing. 3.2 billion people in the 16 countries that have suppressed the epidemic. Who knows what will happen in the Americas? But in the RCEP region, this could be stopped. But India and Indonesia are 2 critical cases. Of course, your neighbors, Pakistan is going to lose it. Bangladesh stands a horrible chance of losing control also. And so this is a very dangerous moment. Focus on public health and really mobilize Reliance, and the other major information companies, and help the government to track, trace, isolate, suppress the epidemic, then I have no doubt the economy will follow successfully.
Yeah, that's very appropriate advice, Jeff. Arvind, one last question with you. In the last few months, there has been this hope and expectation that industry will move out of investments will move out of China, and India should be a beneficiary. We should be really now looking forward to fairly significant flows of investments on a rebound from China to India, but that hasn't materialized. We've seen this moving to Vietnam, Indonesia, and so on. But yet there is hope. You've seen Indian economy at the closest quarters, right? What do you think are our chief weaknesses in our competitiveness in order to be able to attract this? And why are we failing?
Well, that's a subject of the book I just wrote. It came out in India called India Unlimited. And I provide a very detailed roadmap. I think, these are issues we have discussed for a long time. We are not doing this. Labor market remains a problem. Land markets remain a problem. Financial sector is fragile. So all the factor market issues are in there. What I suggest, is there is a shortcut to it, which is a Shenzhen style kind of coastal, what I call them autonomous employment zones. On the coast, and maybe, some can be in the hinterland as well. But, start out with half a dozen of these large areas. You have to pick up something like 200 to 300 square kilometers of areas and give them full autonomy of policy. This is what Shenzhen has. Shenzhen has almost full autonomy. They can do their own labor laws. They can do their own land laws. So do that. It's not a high cost experiment. It doesn't have to be all virgin land, some of it may be already built up. Include that. It is the rules that you want to change. Rules.
We tried the special economic zone. We tried the national.
No. That's not the model. We turned that into a land grab kind of operation. That's not what this is. Shenzhen is not a special economic zone. I mean, they called it SEZ. That's true. But Shenzhen was like, several hundred square kilometers of area where good policies, good labor laws, good land laws were implemented, good leadership at the local level. And that's the sort of thing you need. And really very rapid movement of goods into and out of that zone, meaning vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Or if you want to think further, think of a Hong Kong, set up a Hong Kong. It need not be offshore physically, but it could be offshore in the figurative sense. And then allow the multinationals to come in and locate themselves there. And if you do that, you tell the rest of the world that India can do it. You also tell ourselves that we can do it. So that is the way to make progress. I think in India, these labor laws, land laws have become very complicated and reform also because, these are concurrently subjects, whether the state is going to do it, center is going to do it. Jump all that, set up just a half dozen of these zones. And it's not a costly affair. So it's not an experiment which, even if it fails, like, you got a whole lot to lose from it. It's a lot less than, your Mumbai-Delhi industrial corridor, which you've been building for a decade and still nothing to show for it. I think you can do this within a couple of years' time. And there are chief ministers. You go to Gujarat, you can do Andhra, you can do Tamil Nadu, you can do Odisha. Chief ministers will love to do that, but the center has to provide the leadership for it.
Thank you, gentlemen. I think we have run out of time. So very appropriate messages. Just get your public health in shape. Focus on getting the pandemic under control. Keep engaged with not merely China, but the rest of the world, because opportunities do come about. When you have a situation like this in a crisis, you find new opportunities coming up. So don't let that go away. Reform, and particularly build the capabilities to be able to attract investments and get the kind of investments that China did in some of these economic zones. So let's move forward with the hope and confidence is the message that I'm getting from both of you. Thank you very much, gentlemen. since we have run out of time, we have to close now without the Q&A. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.